Welcome to the Building a Successful Practice podcast channel, brought to you by the Foundation for Physician Advancement. FPA is a nonprofit built by Marney Reid and a collective of world-class surgeons to provide education and experience on the leadership development and practice management aspects of medicine. I'm Marney Reid, founding board member of FPA, and I hope you enjoy today's podcast with our incredible faculty.
On today's episode, we'll discuss the nuances of private equity, partnering with orthopedic practices, and questions surgeons should be asking before they enter into this arrangement. Our faculty today range from consultants who have 10 plus years experience advising physician groups around the country on everything from health system alignment to deals with private equity. We have an attorney who advocates for physicians in these deals through employment contracts to ensure the junior and senior partners, and surgeons in various tenures of their practice who are currently partnered with PE and strategics get what they truly need. Let's start with Dana. As someone who assists physicians of all subspecialties on market positioning and strategy, what external factors should a group take into account when they're really assessing private equity versus partnering with their local health systems or even aggregating with other small, mid-sized practices in their market?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marnie, and thanks for doing this educational session. So important right now. You know, it's really changed a lot over the last year, and actually even over the last 6 months. A lot of groups are really considering their market conditions and their situation as far as their financial situation and looking at what their real goals are. There's been a lot of chaos in the market, and I think we've all seen that in the news as of late, a lot of chaos in the financial markets. And so they really need to take into account what they're trying to achieve long term. I think the thing that's the biggest change in the last 12 months is it's not just private equity or health system or independent practice. There's a bunch of new players in the space as well. There's family offices. So think, Walton, Rockefeller type of families that are looking to partner with physician groups. There are payers. So we have payers that have started investing in the space, whether it's Optum. We've had some other payers that are looking at the space and investing. And then we've had other strategics, even GPOs. So Cardinal and McKesson and other folks are also starting to buy up physician practices. So it's a very different conversation, Marnie, than it was just when you were looking at private equity. I think for now, with the current market conditions, what I would be looking at if I were a physician is, does that private equity have experience in the physician space? What is their balance sheet? So how are they leveraged? What are they investing in? What have they done before? And then also, I always suggest that doctors really look at the other doctors in their portfolio companies to see, is it really the creme de la creme, or did they buy up a bunch of physicians that were kind of, orphan children and put them together in a fund? It's a very, very interesting time right now. And I think doctors have a really unique opportunity in the future based on all the nuanced players that are coming into the space.
It's the private equity match process. Peter, you've been in practice now for 3 years and signed with a group who had just partnered with a large PE company. What concerns, if any, did you have going into this practice?
Yeah, for me, I really wanted to be a business owner, and being a part of a private practice, was my opportunity to be a partner, have autonomy, and, have my stake and my share in the company. And so one of the things that I asked for and made sure that was in my contract is that the normal partnership tract would still be intact no matter what kind of private equity deal was made, because I didn't want to just end up being an employed surgeon working for this big private equity company. If I wanted to be employed, I would have just went to a hospital system or to an academic center. So that was probably one of my main concerns. And, this practice really put that at ease, is that they want people to come in to be partners. The private equity wants people to come in and be partners and participate, in the business and trying to make it as successful with the highest quality as possible.
I think we call that skin in the game.
Exactly.
So what steps, either from a legal standpoint, email documentation, because emails can be held up in a court of law, did you take to make sure that tract would be available for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure, we talked about on this podcast and many others with you, making sure that you have a good contract lawyer and hopefully someone that specializes, in orthopedics at best, but at least in medicine is really important. Sometimes it's hard to get some of these things into this specific employment agreement, right? Because it's kind of a standard employment agreement they're using for a lot of different people. But the one thing you kind of just mentioned is if you make some strong points with them and they agree with them, they'll certainly be willing to write in an email or make an addendum to the employment agreement. So I highly recommend that you do that. If there's things that are talked about, behind closed doors, you can ask the CEO or ask the president, would you be comfortable if I say this in an email to you? I want to make sure that this conversation, that was really important to me, that what we said here can stick. And most of the time, they shouldn't really have a problem with it. And if they do, that's probably a red flag.
I agree. And I bet Emily's just sitting there chomping at the bit with some of her thoughts.
Dr. Matt Shirley, you happen to be at a Foundation for Physician Advancement weekend course where Dana gave a didactic about private equity and considerations, and then there was a panel of surgeons really just talking about things to consider, what to watch out for, benefits, challenges, etc.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Marney. I do remember sitting in that didactic with Dana, and I remember thinking, boy, I'm really glad I don't have to think about any of that, because the group that I was discussing and I actually had already signed a preliminary contract with had assured me they were not going to partner with any private equity entity. And then, as you noted, I found out on an airplane, right before I boarded an airplane, actually, to go to a course that they had engaged in conversations and were actually in like the due diligence phases of it. And my first thoughts were, no, Muse, everything up until that point that I'd ever heard of with regard to new partners coming into a private equity acquisition were not good. The rumors were always, well, it only benefits the senior people, junior people get no benefit, they're tied down, with a scrape, and it all fails and you end up looking for a new job. And I think that I'm a reasonable enough person to believe that not everything is one-sided. So the first thing I did, I thought, gosh, I've got a lot to learn. And I need to be my own advocate with this. I was actually pretty scared, to be totally honest with you. And I thought, beside learning and becoming my own advocate, I also had a thought, I need to get a lawyer in this process.
We hear all these stories about, oh, I don't, need a specific lawyer. My friends, girlfriends, partner's father is a lawyer who's going to look at my contract, doesn't know anything about orthopedic surgeons, but he's going to do it for $800. So I'm going with that. So how did you get educated and how did you go about finding the right attorney?
Yeah, so really, I kind of knew from FPA, thankfully, without fluffing you too much. I basically listened to yours and Dana's and Emily's there's a 4-part podcast. I don't know when you guys recorded it, but there's a 4-part podcast I found through FPA that really goes step by step about what private equity in the orthopedic realm look like. And on that plane flight, I listened to the entire thing. I went from start to finish, part 1 through part 4, took notes, because really it was like my life, kind of my career on the line. And it was really, really helpful. It was through that podcast, as well as through my interactions through the orthopedic hip and knee faculty at HSS, that I knew about Emily Asked. And I knew that it probably wasn't going to be cheap, but I did know that I wanted someone who's worked in the space, who's worked with orthopedic surgeons, and who specifically had a finger on the pulse of the hip and knee world. And I don't think that there was anybody beside Emily that could fulfill all those requirements. So I immediately reached out through my connections to get in touch with Emily and engaged her, as well as Dana. I knew that Dana was involved heavily, because honestly, one of my fears was that the group that I was dealing with was unprepared for their negotiations. So I put Dana in contact with the group, 1, to help them to make sure that they were doing the right thing, and 2, honestly, to have a little bit of a mole on the inside to give me information on what this deal looked like and whether there's anything Emily and I could do from my standpoint to help make it most beneficial for me.
So if there weren't the Danas and the Emilys of the world that you had been exposed to, what would you have continued on conversations with that group, or what do you think your practice would look like now versus having involved people like the Danas and the Emilys of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if I had just gone with what the flow was, and I think most private equity entities, honestly, they are not evil and they're not trying to hurt anybody, at least the one that I have a close relationship with now and the ones that I've heard about from other colleagues have gone through this, but the general flow is that you enter into a contract with them and you enter into a partnership track. And to be honest with you, there are some upfront benefits that are pretty good and honestly are better than most traditional private contracts that you would get. So usually a better starting salary, better ancillary support, staff support, better, contracts that look more like hospital employed contracts, but with a track to being a partner. I would say though that those contracts, those, ones that the MSOs and private equity companies want you to sign also then incur a commitment to join and to ultimately have a financial obligation with some equity involvement. I was of the position, and honestly, I don't know how unique, and I think it's fairly unique, that I wanted to keep my original contract, mostly because I didn't want to be completely tied to the private equity entity going forward. Honestly, I wanted myself, my practice, and the private equity group to prove the situation. And so I actually stuck with, and thanks to Emily and to Dana, I stuck with my original contract and gave up some of those upfront benefits that can be very enticing to a new surgeon, but that allowed me to have more latitude, more freedom, and less constraint later on in my career and in my path to partnership. So we negotiated a situation where I was not brought immediately into the private equity entity, and I was supported in that by my partners, as well as by the private equity company that we were working with. And it was actually my first sign that the people I was dealing with were morally based and wanted my best interests. Everybody on board really wanted to do what was best for me. Nobody was forcing me to do anything. Nobody was pressuring me to join or to not join. It really did seem like everybody had my best interest at heart. And that's ultimately why I did it. I think had there been any perception that anybody was trying to take advantage of me, which is the fear of most new surgeons going into this situation, I would have left. I would have taken different job opportunities that I had. So my contract would look very different on the front end. I'd probably be making more money than I'm making right now, but I wouldn't have the freedom that I believe that I have in 1 to 2 years to pivot, to engage, to re-engage, or to do something different with private equity.
Oh, well, I don't think we need to go on with the podcast. I think that's it right there. Emily, you advocate for surgeons on a daily basis for everything from employment contracts to protecting their intellectual property when they decide to go into consulting. What advice do you have for listeners out there? And let's be honest, for listeners who were maybe like Matt, where he sits there and he goes, I would never need to know about private equity. It doesn't apply to me. And maybe you have trainees, but we just need to talk to them. But what are the key considerations that for a first-time contract with private equity, no matter your tenure, need to be considered?
Sure. First, thanks so much for having me. I'm really thrilled and honored to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to break this into somewhat different scenarios. The first would be if you were in a situation like Dr. Shirley's, where you're working and signing an agreement with a group that is not quite yet acquired, but is considering it or in talks to do so. And that's a little different than if you are directly joining a group that is already owned or backed by a private equity or another similar entity. And so as an employee, if you're coming into a private practice as an employee, usually your first 2 to 3 years, and the group is considering private equity or another similar deal, it's really important to ensure that you have a seat at the table. Even if you are a fellow or a resident and you're signing now, a lot can change between now and, a year or two from now. Or if you're going to be an employee for 2 years, you want to ensure that as an employee or not even yet started, if your group is going through these meetings and having conversations about what the future will look like, that you're part of that. And you can actually negotiate that into your contract, that you will be included in board meetings as in a listening capacity to understand what is happening, and that you'll have separate, or as part of the full board meetings, have separate conversations and input into what this will look like for employees like yourself. And then also, if you're in this situation where the group has not yet been acquired and you have a 2 or 3 year partnership track, to give yourself the option to ask for that to be accelerated early. Meaning, in Dr. Shirley's case, as he told you, he opted to stay on the same employment agreement and not become, have an immediate new contract with the private equity group. But that may be in a different scenario what is best for you, and you want to have the option. And so I often will negotiate language into an employment contract that says, if your partnership track is 2 years, but after a year or between years 1 and 2, the group enters into a sale with PE, that shareholder buy-in and shareholder status can be accelerated a little bit early so that you go into that transaction on this equal footing with other partners, so that if there is an upfront sort of a different arrangement for partners that is more beneficial to you, you have the benefit of that. So that would be one thing if you're going to a practice that's in talks. And then to also really understand, if you are signing with a PE group directly or a practice that is backed by a PE group, I think the key things to understand are, of course, the compensation formula and how that's going to be used, and the overhead as well, because that will change a lot with the way that the equity group is bolting on different groups or consolidating. Obviously, the goal is economies of scale, but that doesn't always work out the way people envision. So you really want to understand the nuances of those formulas. And then also, it's really important to understand the vesting schedule. Oftentimes, people will be given some sort of equity in the larger PE group up front, and that sounds great. The thing to understand, though, is sometimes, and actually quite often, that vests on, say, a 4 to 5 year schedule. And so you have to understand, oftentimes, if you leave, if you don't stay for, say, 5 years, either your shares will not be fully vested and you'll lose the benefit of that. Or in other scenarios, I've seen contracts that say you get all the equity up front, but if you leave before 5 years after the transaction, there is a huge haircut on the way out to the buyout, sort of as a penalty for not staying for a full 5 years. So that's really important to understand as well. What happens if you do need to leave, if the situation is just not what you expected? How will that impact you? What are your options? And will that be a real big problem on the way out? And then the final thing I'll mention is, of course, to look at non-competes, especially if you're going from a smaller private practice to now the practice is going to be backed by a much larger group that has other groups under its umbrella. How does that impact if you're in a state where non-competes are enforceable? How does that impact that? Is now the non-compete going to be massively expanded among all the other groups and the other practices under the same umbrella? And how can you, ensure that your non-compete will still, as I always advise, go from the locations where you maintain the clinical practice, not any of the group or multiple groups perhaps under that platform. So those are my top tips.
I think it is very natural for a young surgeon to feel hesitant to getting an attorney involved in this. I had this, I felt like I educated myself. I felt like I knew the people I was dealing with, and I was very tempted to go through this somewhat alone. And when I was bringing Emily on, I was like, oh gosh, is this really necessary? And I think most people don't realize how unwilling they are to actually push the envelope with people they've interacted with already. And I felt somewhat self-conscious of telling these people that I've known for actually a few years that I was bringing an attorney on, because I felt that it maybe projected a certain amount of distrust. But the things that Emily was willing and able to advocate for, the ideas that she had, and I'm sure any good contract attorney would have, were things that I would have never thought of. And even if I had, that I would have never been brave enough to ask for or do myself. So while I did keep my old contract, Emily and I went through and drafted a side letter agreement to that original contract that basically became enforceable the moment that the acquisition occurred, that gave me much more favorable terms that I probably never would have been brave enough, to be honest with you, to ask for going into that. So I think it's critical to recognize that you are probably not the best negotiator alone at the table for this.
Well, from my standpoint, right, coming from a family of attorneys, if you're going to be living day to day with your partners, do you want to be that person that pushes those things? Or do you want to say, I don't know, you're going to have to ask my attorney about that. I would rather just, point to an email or a phone number and say, I don't know, man, I'm just here to take care of patients, ask the attorney. So, it's not just about the money. It's not about the competency. It's about when I go into a situation where I know on a day-to-day basis, I need to make critical decisions and work cohesively, in a family style communal practice. I don't want to be the person that goes, yeah, but what about this? So I agree with you. That's great. So Dana, as Matt, as Emily, who's worked with, multitude of surgeons like this have alluded to, it's really scary going into a partnership where either A, before you sign, or B, you sign, and then let's be honest, the junior partner is never part of these conversations. It's always the senior partner that has several different meetings with several different private equity strategics, and then they come one day and they say, hey, we've decided we're going to do this. So when you advocate for the Matt Shirleys, or when you advocate for an entire practice and you pair them with the right private equity company, what questions do you feel that they're missing the mark if they don't ask upfront to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, Matt and Emily nailed a lot of this, Marney. If the private equity is not worried about the younger partners or surgeons or incoming partners and not asking those questions, it's a red flag. I mean, that is a big red flag. We have a situation right now very similar to Matt's, and we kind of called the senior part. Well, I shouldn't say kind of. We called the senior partners on their bluff because they weren't bringing the junior partners into this. And I basically said there's not enough doctors coming out of school to replace the ones that are practicing. So you really need to take this into consideration. The private equity firm wasn't the one holding them at bay. It was the senior partners that kind of were brokering the deal. That's a red flag to me. I mean, the doctors need to be aligned. That's the stuff post-close that comes out in the end zone that you just don't realize, and you wish you had, to Emily's point, been more knowledgeable about what was happening. So that's a big deal. I think to Matt's point, and it's just really critical, a lot of the younger physicians that are coming out or that are about to get partnership are getting a lot wiser now that there is so much private equity in the physician practice management space. They're asking these questions. They're coming out asking about shareholder agreements and what it means to have equity and when can they get the equity and can they move the equity date up? And I think those are the things that become very, very critical. So long story short, I mean, culture is really critical. And I think looking at the private equity environment, you can see pretty quickly the winners and the losers in the rearview mirror. And so if you can pull some of those questions forward and to Matt's point, get educated, if a doctor doesn't feel comfortable asking, bring in an advisor. That money is well spent money. It'll save you a ton of headaches on the back end. So it's really worth getting educated. It's really worth asking the questions. And frankly, if the private equity is not asking to meet with the junior partners, it's a red flag.
So Matt, how's it going?
Yeah, it is going great. The private equity entity has almost zero influence, impact, or really involvement in my day-to-day. There are meetings that we go to. There are, frankly, improvements in the practice that none of my senior partners ever imagined, that the strategic point of views that a multi-practice MSO brings that honestly make things better. Our contracts are better. We are able to stand up ancillary service lines better. I'm in an interesting position, as I mentioned earlier, where my partners are all, bought in, if you will, to the private equity entity. And I'm not yet, very purposefully. And I'm watching how much each of those positions gets scraped. That's the big thing everyone talks about is the scrape. But I'm also watching the amount of ancillary revenue go up. And while I probably missed out on some upfront equity or equity growth over these couple of years, my main thing was watching what this private equity acquisition could do in terms of building our practice and making it more profitable. And things seem to be going well. I'm in a healthcare market that's dominated by a healthcare giant that makes things difficult, but it's working just fine, it seems. And it's done nothing but help me. In fact, I'll just divulge right now, one of the things that the MSO reached out to me with was saying, hey, you're getting very busy very fast. We'd like to do this. And they fully funded a PA for me early in practice with really no strings attached. And I get it. I'm not naive, right? They're watering a plant that they hope to pick fruit from someday. But it was a second gesture to me from this entity that, we're involved with that they really do care about helping me succeed. And I've never felt anything but that. That being said, I do have friends or partners or people that I know who have been involved in other situations where it has not been like that. And so I guess what I would say is you want to find a partner, a strategic partner, or a practice who is partnered already with somebody or an entity that shows some loyalty to you and shows that they value you. Just like Emily and Dana said, if you don't see that commitment to the younglings, that's a very scary situation. And thankfully, I'm not in that.
There's always good seeds and bads out there. It doesn't matter whether, you're the business end, the clinical end. So I love to hear that it's going well. I remember sitting down across from you at the table when you came in with all your notes and questions before you finished fellowship. So on a personal note, it makes me feel very happy to know that you're thriving out there. So Emily, we're going to wrap it up with you and then Peter. So you see all types of contracts. To Matt's point, he signed a contract that was a little bit more similar to what you may see with an employment contract. What are some of the nuances in the contracts that you're seeing with a health system employment contract versus a private equity contract that people out there should be aware of if they're entering into the latter?
Sure. I would say as between private equity partner in a private practice setting versus health system or hospital employment, of course, the compensation will typically be collections based or, basically cash based, what you bring in a private equity scenario with, as you've heard earlier, usually a scrape off the top of your collections as part of the private equity deal, which, is kind of the exchange for an upfront payment at the beginning. And so that matters. And what happens there is you have to pay attention if you're in the private. And this is neither, I will preface this is neither good nor bad universally, right? It really depends on the situation. But if you're in a cash or collections-based model, your payers matter more and your payer mix and your contracts will matter more than if you're a hospital employment contract where you're typically going to be RVU-based. So you really don't have to think about that, right? You can just do your work on whatever patient and not really think about it. And so you want to think about the market that you're going to be seeing patients in, operating in. If you're going into a private equity situation and there is a collections-based model, you want to make sure that you're not going to be primarily based in a market that has a high level of uninsured or underinsured patients, because that will hinder your ability to generate revenue for the group and for yourself. So those are definitely things to think of. Of course, in the private equity setting, as you heard, there's potentially more and typically more potential for ownership in ancillary revenue streams, including ambulatory surgery centers, which can be very helpful and can really help your practice grow and help give ownership into many different parts of your practice, which is pretty cool. Typically, that will not be the case in a hospital employment, although in recent times, last year or so, there are more hospitals enabling some ambulatory surgery center ownership by physicians or joint ventures or things of that nature. So I think that there's actually more to come on that, and that you'll see more of that in the future, kind of to be able to compete with some of the private equity based or other private practices that can offer those ownership benefits. And then, Dr. Shirley talked about the PA example. Something also to think about, hospital employment, that type of support staff is provided typically and provided by the hospital or the health system without additional cost to the provider. So that can be a nice benefit, but then at the same time, that may be provided only part-time, shared, et cetera, versus in the PE-backed private equity model with a private practice, you may be able to have a PA or hire a PA sooner, but often the salary and benefits, the full cost of that will come out of your collections directly. So you may need to wait a little longer until you can fully support that based on your volume. So those are just some differences to think about.
Peter, seeing as how you've been in practice for 3 years, you've now made partner, what benefits or constraints in general does a PE partner offer a young surgeon with your group, and any advice that you'd like to give the surgeons considering this partnership?
That's a great question. It's obviously different based off of, what practice you're in and what the private equity company is. But at least in my experience, With UMP, for the most part, they're pretty much hands off on the day-to-day of the private practice that you're working in. They're there to help support in terms of, growth financially, helping with surgery centers and hospitals and ancillary revenue type of stuff. But, really the day-to-day is really still managed by you. And I think, one advantage of private practice in general is, you kind of have your own little business within the business. And so you have the opportunity to build whatever team you want, work with medical assistants, physician's assistants, NPs, kind of build what you want. So I think, a good private equity partner, and, I think one that I work for certainly allows each practice to kind of do what they feel is best. And then for you as the individual being in private practice, you really get to kind of build what you want. So again, I think if you're coming in and this PE firm is apparently putting a lot of constraints on what you're allowed to do, I think I would just ask more questions and just make sure that you as the individual and as that practice still maintains, good control of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. Well, everyone, this has been really helpful, and I think will offer a ton of insights to your peers around the country listening in. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Physician Advancement. You can find more great content on our YouTube channel at Building a Successful Practice.